Ashwood Hollow, Ohio. Population 4,206. Though nobody had updated the sign since the Kowalski twins were born, so really it was 4008. It was the kind of town where the loudest thing that happened on a Tuesday was the volunteer fire siren testing at noon, and where every porch light left on past 10 o'clock meant somebody's kid wasn't home yet, and somebody's mother was standing at the screen door, arms crossed, waiting. October 1987. Cold enough for jackets, not cold enough for gloves. The kind of autumn evening where the sky turns the color of a bruise just before the streetlights flicker on, one by one, like the town itself is exhaling. Sam Ostrander was riding his bike home from the radio club meeting at Ashwood Junior High, a coil of antenna wire looped over one shoulder and a transistor radio rattling in his bike basket. He was 12 years old, freckled, missing one front tooth from a skateboard incident he still refused to explain, and he was humming along to a song that wasn't playing. That was his thing. He heard music in the static between stations. His friends teased him about it. His mother said it meant he had a good ear. His father, before he left 3 years back, used to say the boy heard things nobody else could. Nobody knew yet how right that would turn out to be. The route home cut past the old grain elevator on Route 9, a rust-eaten tower that had stopped grinding wheat sometime around Eisenhower's second term. Kids dared each other to touch its chain-link fence at night. Sam wasn't scared of it. Sam wasn't scared of much. Not since his little sister died of pneumonia 2 winters back, and he'd decided, in the private way that grieving children do, that the worst thing had already happened to him, so what else was there to be afraid of? He should have kept that thought to himself. The universe, it turns out, treats a challenge like an invitation. His radio crackled. Not static, a shape of static, if that makes any sense, the kind of interference that has rhythm to it, like breathing heard through a wall. Sam slowed his bike. The streetlight above him buzzed, dimmed, and the bulb inside flexed orange to violet and back, a color that doesn't belong on any bulb ever manufactured. "Hello?" Sam said to the radio because he was 12 and 12-year-olds talk to machines. The radio said something back. Not words. A tone. A held low, chest-deep tone, the kind you feel in your fillings before you hear it in your ears. And underneath the tone, so faint Sam would spend weeks afterward convinced he'd imagined it. A second sound, voices, dozens of them, all speaking at once, all perfectly in sync, like a choir that had learned only a single word and sung it in every language ever spoken. The word was closer. Sam Ostrander's bike was found the next morning, tipped over in the ditch beside the grain elevator fence, front wheel still spinning lazily in the wind. His radio was still on. The battery, fresh that afternoon, was completely dead. Sam Ostrander was not. Ronnie Delgado found out at 7:14 the next morning because Sam's mother called every house on their block asking if anyone had seen him, and Ronnie's mother handed him the phone with a face that told him this was serious before a single word was said. Ronnie was 14, the oldest of their group by 8 months, and he wore that seniority like a badge. Nobody else had voted him. He had a gap-toothed grin he used strategically, and a habit of biting the inside of his cheek when he was thinking hard. Right now, he was thinking hard. By 9 a.m., the whole crew had gathered in Meredith Chu's garage, which doubled as the unofficial headquarters of what they called, half jokingly, half with total sincerity, the Frequency Club. Meredith, who everyone called Fritz because she'd once rewired a garage door opener into a two-way radio at age 9, sat cross-legged on a workbench surrounded by capacitors and a soldering iron that was, as always, slightly too hot. He wouldn't just not come home, Fritz said, not looking up from the walkie-talkie she was field-stripping out of nervous habit. Sam's weird, but he's not that weird. Weird how? Asked Priya Anand, perched on an overturned bucket, sketchbook open on her knee, though she hadn't drawn anything in 10 minutes, just held the pencil like a life raft. He hears things, Dale Kowalski said. Dale was built like a linebacker because he was one, the kind of broad-shouldered 14-year-old who made grown men reflexively check their car locks, and the kind of soft-hearted 14-year-old who once spent an entire afternoon rescuing a nest of baby possums from a storm drain. In the radio static, says it's like a song underneath the song. That's not weird. That's called pattern recognition in white noise, Fritz said. Humans do it with everything. Clouds, wood grain, radio static. It's called pareidolia. Well, pareidolia, or whatever. He's missing, Ronnie said, and his bike's in a ditch. And I think we should go look before the grown-ups turn this into a 2-week search with dogs and a candlelight vigil and a segment on Channel 6. They rode out on their bikes an hour later, the 4 of them, jackets zipped against the cold, following the same stretch of Route 9 that Sam had ridden the night before. The grain elevator loomed up out of the tree line like a broken tooth against the gray sky. They found the police tape first. Sheriff Calloway's department had already been out, roped off the ditch, taken photographs, found nothing they considered useful. What they hadn't found, because they weren't looking for it, was scattered along the inside of the chain-link fence, a thin rime of frost on every third link, in a spiral pattern too deliberate to be weather, and underneath the fence, in the mud, a scorch mark shaped almost like a hand. Fritz crouched by it, frowning. That's not from a fire. Fire doesn't burn in a shape like that. That's more like... She hesitated, because the word felt stupid before she even said it. Like something pressed. Dale towed the mud with his sneaker. Pressed like what? I don't know, Dale. Like a hand pressed through wet cement. Except the mud's not wet cement. It's mud, and it shouldn't hold a print like that unless... Unless what? Fritz didn't answer. She was staring past the fence, into the black mouth of the grain elevator's loading door, hanging open on one hinge. And for just a second, she would swear to this for the rest of her life. She saw the darkness inside move, the way water moves when something big swims just beneath the surface, unseen, patient, and aware that it is being watched. We should tell the sheriff, Priya said quietly. We should tell the sheriff something, Ronnie agreed. Just maybe not everything. Not yet. Sheriff Boone Calloway had been the law in Ashwood Hollow for 11 years, and in that time he had broken up exactly 1 bar fight, arrested exactly 1 meth cook from 3 counties over passing through, and spent most of his career handling raccoon complaints and teenagers drag racing on the county road behind the Baptist church. He was not built for what was coming, and some deep animal part of him had known that since the moment the frost report came across his desk, describing spiral patterns on chain link in October, he didn't believe in much beyond casseroles, football, and the sanctity of a slow Sunday. But he believed in Sam Ostrander's mother's face when she opened her front door, and that was enough to make him drive back out to the grain elevator alone that evening, flashlight in hand, service revolver unclipped for the first time in 3 years. He didn't get far. The elevator's loading door groaned shut behind him the instant he stepped inside. No wind, no reason, just shut. And the darkness beyond his flashlight beam had a texture to it, thick like fog but dry, and it smelled wrong, copper and ozone and something sweetly rotten underneath, like a peach left too long in a hot car. His radio, the department issue handheld clipped to his shoulder, hissed alive with that same rhythmic static Sam had heard. Boone Calloway had never heard static that sounded like it was listening back. "This is Sheriff Calloway," he said, more out of 11 years of habit than any real expectation of a response. "Identify yourself." The static resolved, for one impossible half-second, into a voice. Not a voice speaking words so much as a voice arranging itself out of every voice Boone had ever heard in his life. His late wife's laugh, his father's cough, a stranger's sneeze from a grocery store checkout line 30 years gone. All of it stitched together into something that approximated speech. "We have counted your kind before," it said in the voice of Boone's mother, dead 9 years. "You burn out quickly. You will be quiet soon." Boone Calloway did not scream. He would tell himself that for years afterward, a small mercy he clung to. He did, however, empty 2 rounds into the darkness where the voice seemed to originate, hit nothing but rusted grain chute, and run, genuinely unashamedly run, back out into the October night, where he sat in his cruiser for 11 minutes before his hands stopped shaking enough to drive. He did not go public with what he'd heard, not because he didn't believe it, because he did, completely, and he understood, with the clean, cold certainty of a man whose worldview had just been surgically removed, that if he told anyone, they would take his badge, his gun, and possibly his freedom, And then there would be nobody left standing between Ashwood Hollow and whatever lived inside that grain elevator. So instead, the next morning, Sheriff Boone Calloway did something he'd never done in 11 years on the job. He called a scientist. Her name was Dr. Elena Kessler, and she had spent 6 years of her professional life trying very hard to forget the address of a decommissioned research annex 40 minutes outside Ashwood Hollow, a place that had, until 1984, been officially known as nothing at all, and unofficially known, to the 11 people cleared to work there, as Project Threshold. Boone had gotten her number from a folder he wasn't supposed to have, inherited from his predecessor, marked with a paperclip and a sticky note that just said, "If anything weird." He hadn't understood what that meant until now. Elena arrived in Ashwood Hollow on a Thursday, driving a Buick that badly needed an oil change, wearing a cardigan 2 sizes too big, and the expression of a woman who has spent 6 years waiting for a phone call she dreaded and somehow also wanted. She was 34. She looked 50 around the eyes. "Tell me exactly what you heard," she said to Boone, in the back booth of the Ashwood diner. Over coffee neither of them drank. He told her. The voice made of stitched-together voices. The cold that had no source. The word quiet. Elena closed her eyes for a long moment. "That's the chorus," she said finally. "The what?" "That's what we called it. Internally, never on paper. Dr. Whitfield thought giving it a name made it too easy to talk about, like it was ours to name." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like it was the only warm thing in the room. "It's not from here. Not from... I don't mean another country, Sheriff. I mean another layer. Threshold wasn't studying radio interference. That was the cover story. We were trying to open a door. A door to where? We called it the hollow between. A fold. A place adjacent to ours. Thin in certain spots. Thinner where enough grief and fear and listening have worn the wall down over time. Old buildings. Places where people died badly. Places children get told not to go." She glanced out the diner window toward the horizon where the grain elevator's silhouette sat like a rotted molar against the sky. "We thought we were listening for something. We didn't understand that the something was already listening back. It had been listening for a very long time, cataloging worlds, watching how their people respond when things get taken from them. It doesn't attack out of hunger, Sheriff. It attacks out of curiosity. It wants to know what we do next. And what happens if it doesn't like the answer?" Elena Kessler looked for the first time genuinely afraid. "It's never not like the answer. Every world it's touched has gone quiet eventually. Every single one. That's the pattern. That's the whole reason it keeps doing this." She finally took a sip of the cold coffee. "We shut the project down in '84 because 3 researchers went into the fold and only 1 came back, and she never spoke another word for the rest of her life. I always assumed the door closed behind us. I was wrong. Doors like that don't close. They just wait for someone new to knock." Outside, unseen by either adult, 4 kids on bicycles rolled past the diner window, arguing about whether Fritz's plan, build a directional antenna array powerful enough to trace the source of the frost static, then go in after Sam themselves before the grown-ups could stop them, was brave or suicidal. It would, in the end, turn out to be both. The plan, as plans assembled by 4 14-year-olds and 1 12-year-old's best friend tend to be, was equal parts brilliant and deeply, deeply unwise. Fritz's theory was simple. If the chorus communicated through static, through the shape underneath random noise, then radio equipment wasn't just a way to detect it. It might be a way to talk back. And more importantly, if Sam had been the one who could hear the pattern in the static before anyone else noticed it, then whatever had taken him hadn't grabbed him at random. It had been listening to him specifically, which meant, horribly and usefully, that the door into the hollow between might open easiest wherever Sam's signal was strongest. "So we need bait," Dale said. "We need a frequency," Fritz corrected. "Something that sounds enough like Sam that it thinks he's still broadcasting." Priya, who had been quiet through most of the planning, finally spoke. "I have his voice. From the radio club tape recorder. We recorded the meeting the night before." She swallowed. "He's on tape talking about the static song thing, 20 minutes of it. They built the rig in Fritz's garage over 2 sleepless nights. A jury-rigged directional antenna made from an old TV aerial, a cassette deck wired into a CB radio amplifier scavenged from Dale's uncle's pickup truck, and, at Fritz's insistence, a second recorder running continuously to capture whatever came back. They didn't tell Sheriff Calloway. They didn't tell Elena Kessler. In hindsight, this was the reckless part. But it was also, Elena would later admit, the part that saved everyone, because the chorus had spent 6 years learning to recognize adult fear, adult caution, adult retreat. It had never learned to predict 4 kids on bicycles hauling a homemade radio rig up to a condemned grain elevator on a Friday night, armed with nothing but a cassette tape of their missing friend's voice and a stubborn, bone-deep refusal to leave him behind. Getting the rig there was its own small odyssey. The antenna assembly was too wide to fit in anyone's bike basket, so they lashed it across Dale's handlebars and Ronnie's rear rack with bungee cords. And the whole contraption fishtailed dangerously every time they hit a pothole on Route 9, sparking a running argument about whether they should have just asked Dale's older brother for a ride and lied about where they were going. Fritz vetoed that idea twice. Grown-ups asked questions, and questions slowed everything down, and every hour that passed was an hour Sam spent wherever Sam was, cold and alone and getting further from whatever thin thread still connected him to home. Halfway there, the chain on Priya's bike snapped clean off the sprocket, flinging grease across her jeans, and for one gut-wrenching minute it looked like they'd have to leave her behind or delay the whole plan. Dale solved it the way Dale solved most problems, by picking up her bike, slinging it over one shoulder like it weighed nothing, and telling her to hop on his handlebars instead. Nobody laughed at how absurd they must have looked. 4 kids and a busted bicycle and 40 pounds of homemade radio equipment, careening down a dark county road under a sky gone the color of a healing bruise. There wasn't room left in any of them for laughing. There was only room for getting there. By the time they reached the fence, the moon had cleared the tree line, and the grain elevator's silhouette had taken on the specific, watchful stillness of a building that knows it's being approached. Even Dale, who wasn't given to nerves, found himself checking twice that the bolt cutters were still in his backpack before he'd let anyone move toward the fence line. They cut the chain-link fence with bolt cutters Dale had borrowed from his dad's tool shed. Ronnie went first, because Ronnie always went first. Flashlight raking across a floor thick with decades of dust and pigeon droppings, and unsettlingly, not a single cobweb, as if even the spiders had learned better than to build here. Fritz set up the rig at the center of the loading floor, hands shaking only slightly as she threaded the cassette into the deck. "Once I hit play," she said, "we don't know what happens. It might open a door. It might do nothing. It might—" She didn't finish the sentence. Nobody made her. "Do it," Ronnie said. Fritz pressed play. Sam Ostrander's recorded voice filled the grain elevator, tinny and warm and utterly, achingly alive. "So if you listen right in the gap between 2 stations, right where it's mostly hiss, there's this sound under it, like a whole bunch of people humming the same note but not quite together. And I swear if you listen long enough, you start to hear it get closer to being in tune, like it's practicing." The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 4 seconds. The bulb in Dale's flashlight burst, and on the far wall of the elevator, where a support beam met crumbling brick, a seam of light opened. Not bright light, but a kind of wrongness that the eye insisted on reading as light because it had no other category to file it under. And through that seam came a sound that made Priya drop her sketchbook and made Ronnie's ears bleed faintly at the edges and made Fritz, God bless her stubborn engineer's heart, immediately start recording it on the second deck. The seam widened into a doorway, and beyond it they saw the hollow between for the first time, a version of the grain elevator's interior, but subtly, sickeningly wrong, the walls breathing at the edges of vision, the dust motes hanging motionless in the air like they'd been frozen mid-fall, and threaded through the whole space, hair-thin filaments of a black substance that pulsed faintly, like veins under skin. At the far end of that wrong room, curled small against a wall, was Sam. He was alive. He was, unmistakably, still humming. "Sam!" Dale's shout cracked across the space before anyone could stop him, and that was, in hindsight, the second reckless thing they did that night, though nobody blamed him for it, then or ever. Sam's head lifted. His eyes, when the weak light caught them, had gone strange. Not glowing exactly, but reflective in a way human eyes shouldn't be. Like a cat's caught in headlights. For one terrible second, none of them recognized their friend behind that reflection. Then he blinked, and it was just Sam again, scared and cold and 12 years old. And he said, in a small, cracked voice, "It said it wanted to know what I'd do." "What who wants to know?" Ronnie called through the doorway, though every instinct in his body was screaming at him not to raise his voice in this place. "It doesn't have a name," Sam said. It's like a whole bunch of people who forgot they used to be people. It said it's been counting worlds. It said mine is next. It said..." His voice broke. "It said humans always ask for help, and the ones who ask fastest die quietest, because asking means giving up trying yourself first." Fritz, still crouched over her recording rig, went very still. "That's not a monster philosophy," she said slowly. "That's a hypothesis. It's testing something. It's not trying to kill him. It's trying to see what he does." "What he does about what?" Priya asked. "About being alone and scared and cut off from everyone he loves," Fritz said, and something in her voice had gone hard and fast, the sound of a girl solving an equation with her friend's life as the variable. "It's not attacking us like a monster attacks. It's interviewing us. Every world it's eaten," Elena said, "the pattern's the same. People go quiet. They give up. They stop reaching for each other. That's what it's counting on." Across the threshold, the black filaments threading the wrong room pulsed brighter, and the humming sound resolved, for the first time clearly in every one of their ears at once, into that same stitched-together not voice, layering fragments of every voice each of them had ever loved and lost and missed. "You have come to retrieve the signal," it said, in Priya's late grandmother's voice, in Dale's absent father's voice, in 100 voices belonging to no one they knew, all speaking as one. "This has been observed before. It does not change the outcome. In time you will stop reaching. You always do." Ronnie stepped up to the threshold, close enough now that the wrongness of that other room pressed against his skin like static electricity before a storm. He was 14 years old, and he did not have a plan beyond the plan he'd had his whole life, which was, you don't leave people behind. "You've watched a lot of worlds," Ronnie said, and his voice, to his own considerable surprise, didn't shake. "Did you ever actually ask one of them why they kept reaching, even when it didn't work, or did you just wait for them to stop?" The chorus did not answer immediately, and in the small, ringing silence that followed, Fritz, who had been listening not to the words but to the shape of the static underneath them, the way Sam always had, grabbed Ronnie's sleeve. "It's not omniscient," she whispered. "It's a pattern matcher. A really, really old one. It's read 1,000 worlds ending the same way, and it thinks that's the only ending there is. Ronnie, I don't think it's ever actually seen us finish." Here's the part of the story that Elena Kessler, when she finally heard the full account weeks later, would call, with the specific, weary awe of a scientist who has just watched amateurs succeed where 6 years of federal funding failed, either the bravest or the stupidest tactical decision I have ever heard of, and I genuinely cannot tell you which. They went in, all 4 of them, through the seam in the wall into the hollow between. The wrongness was worse up close. Gravity worked mostly, except when it didn't. Priya's second step landed on a floor that dropped 4 inches lower than her foot expected, and the resulting stumble sent adrenaline screaming through everyone's chest. The black filaments hummed under their feet like sleeping power lines, and everywhere, at the edge of every glance, they caught glimpses of other rooms bleeding through this one. A school gymnasium that wasn't Ashwood Junior High's, a farmhouse kitchen nobody recognized, dozens of half-remembered spaces stitched together from 1,000 worlds worth of grief, the residue of every quiet ending the chorus had ever catalogued. Sam was 10 feet away, curled against the wall, black filaments creeping toward him like slow ivy. Dale reached him first, Dale, whose whole strategy in life had always been get to the person who needs you, worry about the plan after, and hauled Sam up into a hug so fierce it knocked the wind out of both of them. The filaments recoiled from the contact, hissing faintly, retreating an inch, as if the sheer density of care radiating off 2 scared kids clinging to each other was, chemically, unpleasant to whatever the chorus was made of. Fritz noticed that first. "It doesn't like that," she said, urgent. already reaching for the portable cassette deck slung across her chest. The same rig, hastily disconnected from the antenna, batteries still warm. It doesn't like that specifically, not fear, not even courage exactly. It's the connection, the refusing to let go part. The chorus's not voice rose around them again, and this time it sounded for the first time less certain. Connection fails. It always fails. We have watched it fail 1,000 times. You've watched it fail, Ronnie shot back, planting himself between the retreating filaments and his friends. Because you only ever watch the end. You show up, you scare everybody, and then you leave before anybody has a chance to finish trying. That's not data. That's a guy who walks out of the movie theater during the sad part and tells everyone the movie has a bad ending. Priya, of all of them, was the one who understood first what needed to happen. Because Priya spent her whole life turning feelings into images other people could see and hold. She flipped open her sketchbook, dropped in the chaos when they'd first heard Sam's voice on tape, now clutched again in white-knuckled hands, and began, absurdly, impossibly, to draw. Fast, rough lines, Sam laughing with a missing tooth, Dale carrying a shoebox of baby possums, Fritz elbow-deep in wiring with her tongue between her teeth in fierce concentration. Ronnie, gap-toothed grin, always going first. "What are you doing?" Dale hissed. "Giving it something it can't sort into quiet," Priya said, and held the sketchbook up toward the pulsing black filaments like a shield, like an offering, like the bravest and strangest weapon anyone had ever brought into a fight. "This is what it's actually like. Not the leaving, the staying." The chorus, it should be understood, was not evil in the way a storm is not evil. It was old beyond any human framework, for old, older than the concept of Ohio, older than the concept of grain elevators, older, very possibly, than language itself. It had drifted between the thin places of 1,000 worlds, feeding not on flesh, but on finality, on the specific, curdled silence that follows when a civilization decides, collectively and irreversibly, that reaching for each other isn't worth the pain of eventually losing that reach. It had never once stayed to watch what happened after. That was the flaw in its methodology, though it would take Elena Kessler's eventual review of Fritz's recordings, smuggled out, analyzed for months afterward at a kitchen table in a house Elena would move into, specifically because it was close enough to keep an eye on these kids for the rest of her professional life, to properly articulate it in scientific terms. The chorus operated on extraction. It took a person, isolated them, measured the shape of their fear, and extrapolated an entire species' fate from that single, lonely data point. It had never accounted for what happened when the data point refused to stay isolated, when 3 other data points broke down a fence with stolen bolt cutters and walked into the dark after it, on purpose, together. In the hollow between, surrounded by 4 kids radiating the specific, chaotic, gloriously illogical energy of children who have decided that leaving a friend behind is simply not a category of outcome they're willing to accept, the chorus did something it had perhaps never done in all its uncounted eons of quiet harvesting. It hesitated. "This is not the pattern," it said, and for the first time its stitched-together voice cracked at the edges, individual borrowed voices briefly audible and separate before folding back into the chorus of itself. "You should be afraid. Fear precedes silence. This is the sequence." "We are afraid," Ronnie said. And it was true. His hands hadn't stopped shaking since the door opened, and he'd stopped trying to hide it. "You're not wrong about that part. But you skipped a step. Being scared doesn't mean going quiet. Sometimes it means you get loud instead. Sometimes it means 4 kids ride their bikes to a haunted grain elevator at midnight, because being scared together beats being safe alone." Sam, still held tight in the circle of Dale's arm, lifted his head. His eyes had lost that strange, reflective sheen the moment Dale's hug broke through, as if the chorus's hold required isolation to maintain, and isolation had just structurally, permanently failed. "It asked me the same thing, over and over," Sam said, hoarse. "What happens after everyone you love gives up on you?" And I kept telling it, "Nobody's given up on me yet." And it kept saying, "They will. Everyone does eventually." He looked at his friends, all 4 of them crowded close in a room that shouldn't exist. Filaments retreating further with every passing second of contact, of proximity, of stubborn, radiant refusal to be sorted into silence. Guess it was wrong. Fritz held up the cassette deck, recording light glowing steady red. I've got 60 seconds of this on tape, she said, thinking fast, the way she always thought fastest exactly when the stakes were highest. The connection, whatever this is, this thing it can't process, if it hears its own confusion played back, layered against everything it's cataloged as the pattern, it'll short out, Priya breathed, like radio feedback. Too much contradictory signal at once. Only one way to find out, Ronnie said and grabbed the deck's rewind switch himself. They did not have time for a perfect plan. They had, instead, 63 seconds of tape, a battery pack running low, and a doorway back to Ashwood Hollow that Fritz, watching the seam in the wrong room's wall, was fairly sure was starting, almost imperceptibly, to shrink. When it closes, Fritz said, working the rewind by feel, eyes on the shrinking seam. We don't know it opens again. We have to go now, or play this now, and I genuinely don't know if we have time for both. Then we do both, Ronnie said, at the same time. Dale, Sam, go, now, through the door. Priya, go with them. I'm not leaving you two, Priya said, already backing up, sketchbook clutched to her chest, torn between the instinct to run and the instinct that had brought her into this wrong place to begin with. You're not leaving us, Ronnie said. You're getting Sam out. That's the job. Everybody's got a job. Go. Dale didn't wait to be told twice. He swept Sam up properly now, piggyback, the way you'd carry a much smaller kid, and Sam, exhausted and shaking and 12 years old and alive, wrapped both arms around his neck and didn't argue. Priya went with them, one hand fisted in the back of Dale's jacket, and the three of them crossed the wrong floor toward the shrinking seam of light. That left Fritz and Ronnie alone in a room built from the collected grief of 1,000 dead worlds, with a cassette deck, a dying battery, and the accumulated, patient, uncomprehending attention of something old enough to have watched stars die. Fritz hit play. 63 seconds of sound poured into the hollow between. Sam's voice, cracked with fear, insisting nobody's given up on me yet. Ronnie's voice, unshaking by force of will, declaring being scared together beats being safe alone. Dale's wordless roar of a hug. Priya's sketchbook pages riffling like a flipbook of a boy's whole ordinary, unremarkable, precious life. The missing tooth, the humming, the walkie-talkie code names. None of it epic, all of it, apparently, completely indigestible to a mind built to catalog only endings. The chorus screamed. It was not a sound designed for human ears, and every filament in the room lit white-hot for one blinding second, and the wrong room itself seemed to buckle inward, walls rippling like disturbed water, as 63 seconds of stubborn human contradiction fed back into a pattern recognition engine that had never, not once in its impossibly long existence, encountered a data point it couldn't sort. This does not resolve, it howled in every voice it had ever borrowed at once, a sound like a choir falling down a flight of stairs. The sequence requires silence. You have not provided silence. Why have you not provided silence? Because we're not finished yet, Ronnie said, grabbing Fritz's free hand, and they ran, not toward the shrinking seam so much as through the chaos the tape had bought them, the black filaments writhing and retreating in every direction, confused, overloaded, the wrongness of the room folding in on itself like a book being slammed shut. And they hit the threshold half a second before it closed for good, tumbling out onto the dusty floor of the grain elevator in a tangle of limbs and static-charged hair, gasping actual cold, ordinary Ohio October air. Behind them, the seam in the wall sealed with a sound like a held breath finally released, and then there was nothing. No light, no wrongness, no humming, just an old grain elevator, dark and quiet and entirely, blessedly mundane. Dale, Priya, and Sam were already there, waiting, having come through moments before. Sam was crying, the unguarded, hiccuping way 12-year-olds cry when they're finally allowed to stop being brave. Nobody told him to stop. They all just held on. Sheriff Boone Calloway found them an hour later, having finally worked up the nerve to drive back out with Elena Kessler in the passenger seat and a shotgun he sincerely hoped he wouldn't need. He found 5 kids sitting on the curb outside a dark, silent, entirely unremarkable grain elevator, sharing a bag of gas station licorice like nothing in the world had happened, except that Sam Ostrander, reported missing 36 hours earlier, was among them, alive, cold, exhausted, and very firmly wrapped in Dale Kowalski's varsity jacket. Nobody in Ashwood Hollow ever got the full story. Officially, Sam had wandered off, gotten disoriented, and sheltered in the grain elevator overnight. Embarrassing, mildly newsworthy, and entirely survivable as far as the Ashwood Gazette was concerned. Sheriff Calloway filed the report himself and made sure it stayed that simple. Unofficially, 5 kids and 1 deeply relieved, quietly guilt-ridden research scientist knew the truth, and they kept it the way you keep the good kind of secret. Not out of shame, but out of the understanding that some things are too large and too strange to survive being explained to people who weren't there. Elena Kessler stayed in Ashwood Hollow. She told her former employers that Project Threshold's anomaly had been self-resolving, which was true in the most technical, least helpful sense possible, and quietly ensured that nobody in a government building ever got curious enough to knock on that particular door again. She opened a small radio repair shop on Main Street instead, and if you asked her why a physicist with a doctorate was fixing car stereos for a living in a town of 4,000 people, she'd just smile and say she liked working with her hands now. She kept Fritz's 63-second recording in a locked drawer, along with careful notes on frequency and interference patterns nobody but her would ever read. Not out of secrecy, but because some kinds of courage deserve a record, even a private one. Sam Ostrander went back to school 2 weeks later. He still heard music in the static between stations. He didn't mention it to anyone but the 4 people who already knew, and on Friday nights the 5 of them still met in Fritz's garage. Though now, when they built things, they built them a little more carefully, and Fritz kept an emergency cassette deck charged and ready in a drawer, just in case, a phrase that had taken on considerably more weight than it used to carry. Ronnie Delgado grew up to do a lot of things. None of them, notably, involved staying quiet when something needed saying, in a classroom, a courtroom, or a town council meeting. Dale Kowalski became, of all things, a paramedic, the kind who carries people out of impossible situations for a living, and never once, in 20 years on the job, mentions the first time he did it. Priya Anand's sketchbooks eventually became something people paid to see hung on gallery walls, though she never sold the drawings from that particular October, and never explained to buyers why not. Fritz, Meredith Chu, went on to build things far more sophisticated than a garage radio rig, and somewhere in a lab decades later, running tests on signal patterns nobody else thought to look for. She would occasionally still catch herself listening, out of old habit, for a hum underneath the noise that didn't quite belong. It never came back. Not to Ashwood Hollow, anyway. Whether it found some other thin place, some other grieving town, some other lonely kid who heard music in the static, that's a question nobody in Ashwood Hollow was ever able to answer, and most of them, if you asked, would tell you they preferred not to think about it too hard. But here is the thing the chorus never understood. In all its uncounted eons of counting worlds down into silence, the thing it could never have learned, because it never once stayed long enough to watch a story finish instead of just its saddest chapter. Humans don't go quiet. Not really. Not for long. You can take one of us and put us somewhere dark and cold and utterly alone, and for a little while, yes, we're afraid and we doubt, and some part of us starts to believe the silence might be permanent. And then a friend cuts a fence with stolen bolt cutters, and someone plays a cassette tape at exactly the right moment. And somebody who has never once in his life let go of anyone he loved decides, quite calmly, that tonight is not the night that changes. That's the part the ending never shows you, if you leave too early. We stay. We reach. We hum the tune back, off-key and imperfect and together, until whatever's listening in the dark finally understands that it picked the wrong species to wait out. Every year, on the anniversary, the 5 of them still find a way to be in the same room, even decades later, even scattered across 3 time zones and a dozen different lives. It's never planned far in advance. Someone just calls, a real phone call, never a text, that's a rule none of them ever had to write down, and says some version of you doing anything Friday, and somehow, every single year, the answer is no, because some nights you don't miss, not ever, not for anything. They don't talk about the hollow between much, even now. They don't need to. It comes up sideways instead. In the specific way Dale still can't stand total silence in a room and always has a radio or a television murmuring somewhere in the background, just enough noise to know he isn't alone. In the way Priya's gallery openings always, without fail, include one drawing not for sale, tucked in a back corner where only people who know to look for it ever notice a rough ballpoint sketch of a boy with a missing tooth. In the way Fritz, decades into a career nobody in Ashwood Hollow could have predicted for the girl who once rewired a garage door opener at 9 years old, still keeps an old cassette deck on a shelf in her office, unplugged, silent, entirely decorative to anyone who doesn't know better, and entirely, deliberately, within arm's reach. And in the way Sam Ostrander, 40-some years old now, married with a daughter of his own, still can't drive past a certain stretch of Route 9 without his hands tightening slightly on the wheel, and still on quiet nights catches himself listening in the gap between two radio stations, out of nothing but old habit, for a hum that never quite comes back. If you ask him whether he's afraid of that silence, he'll tell you no, not anymore, because he learned something in that cold, wrong room that the thing which took him never managed to unlearn about itself in all its uncounted eons of watching worlds go quiet. Silence isn't really an ending. It's just the part of the story where nobody's decided to answer yet. Somebody always does, eventually. That's the whole point. That's the part it never stuck around long enough to see. Ashwood Hollow, Ohio. Population 4,008. Home, as far as anyone in town would ever officially admit, to nothing stranger than one very long, very cold night in October, and 5 kids who never did tell the whole story, because some frequencies, once you've heard them, you carry for the rest of your life without ever needing to say a word.